Hi, I'm Caroline.
And I'm Adrienne.
And this is Scandal Sheets. Hello and welcome to Scandal Sheets, the podcast that explores the scandals of history along with the people and places associated with them. I am your host, Caroline.
And I'm Adrienne, swooning over the picture of Henry Flagler.
Oh, yes. Whew. Yes, seriously.
Flagler was a hottie.
He's some serious hotness
fanning
going on
myself
there
right now.
But no, that's just because your house is hot.
Oh, to some people.
Yes.
So if you haven't checked it out, look at the Instagram feed of a picture of a very young Henry Flagler.
Yes.
Who was smoking hot.
He was smoking hot. Oh, I needed that after today. But so yes, today we are going to be discussing Henry Flagler, who, if you are not familiar with him, he was one of the founders of Standard Oil.
And Mr. Railroad.
And Mr. Railroad and Mr. Hotelier. Is that how you spell it? Hotelier? No, hotelier.
You don't say... You would say you would say hotelier.
Yeah,
like
hotelier.
Atelier, like front.
Right.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, that works. We'll go with
right.
that. So yeah, I'm super excited because Henry Flagler was pretty much the first person to decide that Florida needed to be developed into a tourist destination.
Sure.
And was responsible for a couple of hotels in St. Augustine, Florida.
Yes.
Which is where I basically grew up. I like to say that because I spent...
I don't think I knew that.
Every summer of my life
really?
there. Yeah.
Out at the beach? St. Augustine Beach?
No, just in and around the city. Yeah, in town. First, my great-grandparents had a summer home there, and then my grandparents bought a summer home there, so...
I like it there.
I love it there, and I really think that's the reason I ended up in historic preservation was because I spent... most of my childhood.
Of course, yeah.
Running around the 500-year-old buildings.
Yeah,
so.
The oldest continuously occupied European settlement in North America.
That's right. So, yeah, I love St. Augustine. Get past the touristy...
fact that it's in Florida.
Gimmicky crap.
Just kidding, I love Florida. I do. I only say that because I love everything about Florida.
Right.
It's just the weirdest damn place, and I love it.
Yeah. So, yeah, get past the touristy gimmicky stuff and the old people and dig in because it's a great little city. I would totally live there. Besides, it's swampy like Charleston, so I'm used to it now.
It is no worse. People complain about the Florida weather, and I'm like it is no worse
than
here
this. Absolutely not.
And elsewhere in the South. So
right.
Florida, not that bad.
So, yeah, St. Augustine.
Mm-hmm.
But before Henry gets to St. Augustine, he has to be born. So Let's jump right in. So Henry Morrison Flagler was born on January 2nd, 1830 in Hopewell, New York, to the Reverend Isaac Flagler and Elizabeth Caldwell Morrison Harkness Flagler. Yes.
Okay. I just heard the name Caldwell, and it reminded me of Marjorie Caldwell from the Glen Sheet story.
Yeah,
and I'm sure that's not
no relation.
At all, probably no relation. I just think it's interesting.
So his family was very confusing, so try to keep up. His mother, Elizabeth, was a widow twice over, so that's why she is...
Did she kill her husband, or they just happened to die? She
just had very bad misfortune of marrying men who had no longevity, apparently. So first she was married to Hugh Morrison and had no children by him. Then she married Dr. David Harkness, and together they had Daniel Harkness. Now, Dr. Harkness was also a widower, so he brought a son named Stephen into his marriage with Elizabeth, but then he died. So Elizabeth...
So she has a natural child and a
stepson,
okay.
And she actually took both of them with her when she relocated to New York, which is where she grew up. This was going down in Ohio originally. It was in Hopewell where she met and married Reverend Isaac Flagler, and together they had Henry. Now, apparently, the Reverend was a struggling pastor and also an itinerant farmer. And either profession did not bring much money to them. So the two older sons quickly left to make their way in the world. Both Stephen and Daniel moved to Ohio to work with their paternal uncle, Lamont Harkness, who owned a general store and also a grain business, I believe.
Okay.
After finishing 8th grade, and I've read 2 accounts that he actually finished 8th grade and that he also dropped out of 8th grade, Henry moved to Ohio as well to work with his Harkness brothers, so 1 half brother and 1 stepbrother. He was paid $5 a month plus room and board. So he worked that way and began basically working his way up. He quickly proved himself to be an excellent salesperson, so he was promoted through the years. And in 1852, at the age of 22, Henry joined his half-brother Daniel's newly formed company. And then the next year, on November 9th, 1853, he married Mary Harkness, who was his step-cousin.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So there's no blood relation at all.
No blood relation. Yeah.
Got it. It was his random non-brothers.
Yeah.
It's just...
Well, his...
No.
Well, I mean,
No, I'm sorry, that's not right.
But it's not his mother's side. It would be the father...
Yes.
That was not his father.
Yes.
I know. See, it's just so confusing.
Yep. Okay.
So they had, they were married in 1853. They had 3 children together. Jenny Louise was born in 1855. Carrie was born in 1858. And unfortunately, Carrie died at the age of 3 in 1861. Then there was a pretty substantial gap, and their son, their last child, was born in 1870. In 1862, Henry Flagler and his brother-in-law, Barney York, they founded the Flagler and York Salt Company. So it was based in Saginaw, Michigan.
Okay.
So Flagler and his family moved there. And the company prospered during the Civil War because salt was needed by the Union Army as a preservative.
To keep food. Right. Yeah, okay.
But then after the war ended, the need for salt declined sharply and the company soon collapsed. So Henry was forced to return to Ohio.
Wait, but there's still no refrigeration. Why would they not still need...
I guess it was probably...
But there's literal ice boxes, I guess. Right. Okay.
Yeah, people...
Still a decline because the demand's not nearly as much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because, I mean, salt pork was one of the key things that was fed to soldiers.
Okay.
So if you no longer had all that, having to feed hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and I think the need would decline sharply, even though in general you would need salt. So after the company collapsed, Henry returned to Ohio. He was $100,000 in debt. Some of it was owed to his half-brother and some of it to his step-uncle, who he originally apprenticed to back in the day. He apparently decided that he would never invest in another business without first researching it. So it sounds like a pretty good plan.
Really? Yes.
After returning to Ohio, Henry went back to his roots and began working in the grain business again. He quickly repaid his debts, but more importantly, he made the acquaintance of one John D. Rockefeller, who was working as a grain broker as well.
Really?
So around this time, Cleveland, Ohio was developing as a center for the oil refining industry. And so Rockefeller decided to start his own company. But he needed capital, so he approached Flagler about helping him do that. And so Henry borrowed $100,000, and along with Samuel Andrews, who was an inventor who already had a little bit of experience in shale oil production, the 3 of them formed Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler in 1867. So the Flagler family moved to Cleveland and purchased a house on Euclid Avenue, which was also known as Millionaires Row.
I've heard of that.
So by 1870, the company was reorganized as a joint stock corporation named Standard Oil. And that same year, Henry's wife, Mary, gave birth to the couple's last child, who was Henry Harkness Flagler. And I find it very interesting that he seemed to be very attached to his Harkness family, even though he wasn't really technically related to them.
That does seem odd.
He didn't really seem to have any use for his actual birth father, so... things were, of course, going great for Henry at this time. By 1872, Standard Oil was dominating the American oil refining industry, taking out smaller companies by driving down prices so the company could acquire its competitors. This plan of attack was apparently hatched by Henry. He called the process sweating out the competition. Standard Oil would become synonymous with John D. Rockefeller. He was kind of like the public face, and Flagler was kind of behind the scenes calling the shots.
So where did he learn his business acumen?
They said that
just
he was
apprenticing because he did not go to college.
Right, didn't go to college. Was
that's amazing.
Given 8th grade
who
dropout. Yeah,
he was
right. He just seemed to have a natural ability and intelligence. They said that even though he wasn't much for formal schooling, he was a voracious reader. So he was constantly reading and trying to improve himself. So.
Right.
So, like I said, the face of the company was John D. Rockefeller, but Flagler was kind of in the background calling some of the shots. And he was very much part of the strategy that made Standard Oil this dominant force in the U.S. Now, Standard Oil would go on to eventually own 85% of Cleveland's oil refineries.
Oh my gosh.
And this was accomplished by not very moral means. We'll get there. Well, we are getting there, actually. So,
almost
there. In 1875, Standard Oil moved its headquarters to New York City, and the Flagler family moved into 509 Fifth Avenue 2 years later.
So it's odd that the headquarters moved to New York, but all the business was in Ohio.
Well,
all the refineries were in Ohio.
Yeah, but by then they'd expanded because Pennsylvania and Baltimore, Pittsburgh, a lot of those places had.
So that was, and you wanted a New York address, I suppose.
Right. It was kind of, New York was considered the epicenter.
Yeah.
So they wanted to all be there.
Okay.
So the company continued to grow unabated, and in 1879, Flagler, Rockefeller, and several other important people associated with the company were indicted for trying to form a monopoly.
Oh.
So none of the men were convicted, but this legal action would be the impetus for decades of investigations and trials that would eventually bring down many of these original corporations and their robber baron owners.
Yeah. Well, if they owned 85%, I don't think you could say they weren't doing something a little bit shady to have that kind of power.
Well, and it was a female journalist by the name of Ida Tarbell, who was actually one of the original muckraking journalists of the time period.
Hearst? No.
Or leading up to that, yeah. Muckraking became before yellow journalism.
Okay.
She doggedly chronicled these corporations and even published an expose of the history of the Standard Oil Company. Turns out her father had been driven out of the oil business in Cleveland, and
she had a bone to pick.
Right, sure. Exactly. Standard Oil had tried to buy him out, and he refused and tried to compete, and it didn't go well. So she interviewed dozens of people involved with Standard Oil, and including Henry Flagler. She later recounted that the interview, saying that Flagler refused to give any specifics about the origins of the company. She said that he regaled her with the, quote, story of how the Lord had prospered him. I was never happier to leave a room, but I was no happier than Mr. Flagler was to have me go. So Tarbell would eventually uncover Standard Oil's sweetheart deals with the railroads. Basically, they said, hey, if you cut us a break,
shipping
on the shipping, so we can drive down prices, then
we'll get more business.
Right, exactly. Okay. She ended up publishing a 19-part series in McClure's magazine.
Oh.
And this sparked national rage over the company's disreputable and cold-hearted practices. And, of course, this would eventually lead to the company being broken up after a 1911 antitrust lawsuit.
I feel like I remember learning about that in school.
Yep, I do believe you're correct. Henry's private life was getting a bit strained as well. New York winters are not very forgiving, or so I hear. I've never been to New York in the winter.
I haven't either. I've lived in Minnesota in the winter, though, and I know it's way worse.
It's way worse, yeah.
Yeah.
The weather was very harsh in New York, and Flagler's wife, Mary, had always been rather of a poor constitution. Actually, Henry was very devoted to her care. Despite the social standing they would have had in New York, the couple never entertained, and he rarely left her side to attend social engagements.
That's interesting.
In 1878, her physician said, hey, you probably should take her to a warmer climate. So they moved to Jacksonville.
I feel like at that point, in Florida's history, it seems odd that they would choose Jacksonville.
Yeah, well, they were saying that
it's not like nothing was there, but
they said you couldn't really go past there. That the linkages were not there.
Correct.
So, but they did, and